Yet around the world the situation is actually deteriorating, not least after the failure of Copenhagen to galvanise international action. But in the face of these grim forecasts, we cannot maintain our dignity if we sink into apathy or party as if there are no tomorrows. We must, in the face of this scenario, we must act and aim to make the best future we can in the circumstances we now face. So what we must do is build resilient communities, self-sustaining economies and democratic systems that seek to spread the burdens fairly. We have been conned, but it's also true that we've been conning ourselves. And the sooner we face up to the full truth of what the climate scientists are trying to tell us, the sooner we can begin to prepare for a new world under a transformed climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive. Just to kick off this panel discussion, I'd like to just tease out a few issues that Ross raised that I think are particularly important. I guess, Ross, Australia, more has been written at least about decarbonising Australia's economy than any other nation. I don't think many other countries have done a Garnaut report. And yet we're still stuck. We can't take the first step. You've explained a little bit about why that might be, but can you tell us what's changed? I mean, why it's still so damn difficult despite all of that information?
Well, I can't say that I'm still not surprised we've done so badly. It's true that there hasn't been another country that's had the detail work done on how you would actually go about decarbonising the economy and demonstrating that this could be done at moderate sacrifice to growth in the standard of living in the short term, and of course with the benefit of preserving the standard of living in the long term, which otherwise will be under threat. I think that it does come down to political leadership. I think there was an opportunity in this country created by the very large public interest that there is in this subject and the information base that was developed in this country. There was an opportunity for leadership. In the end, crucial leaders judged that the political forces that didn't want to go down a mitigation path were more threatening to them than the disappointment of the interests of people who were committed to Australia doing its part in a world effort to reduce the risks of dangerous climate change. I think they might have miscalculated. I think there was an opportunity. There's no doubt that the deterioration of our political culture in the last decade has made it more difficult to implement policies in the national interest in the face of vested interests. But even given all of that, I think there was a base in community interest. I think there still is a base in community interest and information for leaders who want to appeal over the head of vested interests to the community at large could be successful.
I must say that's an interesting perspective, Ross. It makes me think, I mean, you were advising the Hawke government during the time when we were having pretty profound tariff reform and banking reform in this country. And I can't recall either of those governments going to the people and saying, well, we're going to remove all the tariffs, all the protection of your jobs and everything else, and yet it happened. How is it that back then we could do those profound reforms which have benefited everyone, and yet I think probably would remain unpopular if you'd ask people today about them?
Well, even in those days, political leaders looked at opinion polls, and the opinion polls showed consistently that Australians love protection. there was never anything like the support for reduction in protection that there is for doing something serious about climate change. And so that just compounds the puzzle for why our leaders haven't taken action. I think there was probably never more than about 40% support for trade liberalisation, but the government of the 80s decided that this was important in Australian interest. Now, Hawke put huge efforts into public education. He talked about these things a lot before actually doing them, so he didn't ignore public opinion. He tried to provide, to strengthen the base of information, but then was prepared to take a decision. He would have loved the sort of support for action that there is for climate change, because now, even after the departure from leadership of the major political parties, there's still a substantial majority of the Australian community that wants strong action taken. So I think that the biggest difference is one of leadership.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Could I turn now to you, Bill, and just ask you, having come from the US, we see everything from a distance here, but there has been some pretty extraordinary things happen in your country over the last 6 months. One of the ones I'm most curious about is really what the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico has done in terms of energy policy, public perception, corporate perception of liability and risk around those areas. Really, in short, whether you think that represents any sort of transformational moment and how it may play out in terms of addressing climate change.
It's a very good question, Tim. On the one hand, of course, it's the visibility of the oil spill is almost a problem, because it causes people to think, go back to the days of thinking that environmental damage is something nasty to look at, and because we can see this, and so I keep writing pieces saying, look, even if that oil gets safely ashore and burned in your car, it's still a huge disaster, in many ways a more powerful one. But in political terms, you may be right. It's possible that it's possible that it will cause Obama to do the thing he hasn't done heretofore and offer some real leadership on these issues. He's kind of exposed, because 3 weeks before this happened, he lifted a long-standing moratorium on offshore drilling and told everybody that it was safe. So right now he looks bad, and he may compensate for that by trying to actually push some legislation through the Senate. But even if he does, it's not a very good bill, and it'll be an enormous fight. And the reason that it'll be an enormous fight there as here as everywhere is that we haven't built yet the kind of movement we really need to force political action. And that I think is the bottom line for a lot of this. What Ross said about Kevin Rudd fearing more the power of the coal interests than of people who are concerned about climate change is precisely the political dynamic that we see in every capital, including America's. And it's why we're working so hard to finally build the movement that we should have built around the world 20 years ago. On October 10th this year, we'll be doing for 350 this, instead of a kind of global political rally, we're doing this global work party. And in thousands of places, people will be putting up solar panels or digging community gardens, all the things that Clive quite rightly points out we need to be doing anyway to start building the kind of resilient communities we need. But the political message that we're going to try to send is, if we can get to work, you can get to work to our leaders. If I can climb up on the roof of the school and hammer in a solar panel, then you can climb to the floor of the Senate and hammer out some legislation. And we got to start holding leaders really accountable in some way, or this is never going to happen. As you point out, I come from a distance, so I have no right offering Australians any political advice, except to say, having read the newspapers today, if I were you, I would worry less about holding people accountable for going into gay bars and more about this kind of work, you know.
No, that's absolutely right, Bill, I'm sure. The thing that... the reason I'm interested in that oil spill is that, in a sense, I think the philosophy of the oil industry in the US and the coal industry in Australia are a bit similar. They can both see that there's a use-by date somewhere down the track, or there's going to be increasing problems. But both are going hell for leather now to make as big a profit as they can and get as much out of the resources they can in the short term while they're able to do that. It was interesting, I was with Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP, at the World Business Summit in Copenhagen in May. And it was clear then he was the march away from, the solar investments they'd made and everything was already on. But there was no sense there that they were building a liability or that the level of risk was elevated. As you go for deeper water deposits, which have to be larger to be able to be, to make money out of them, and also just the technologies. You're right at the edge of all of those technological things.
These guys are... they're not beyond petroleum, they're beyond irresponsible. I mean, they dug a hole in the bottom of the sea with no ability to take care of easily predictable accident. Yeah. And that they've been able to get away with it is a consequence mostly of the incredible deregulation of the last 20 years in the U.S. And it will, the question is whether the political fallout will be constrained to the details of the accident, whether we will now spend a lot of time worrying about putting blowout preventers on oil rigs, something that should be so obvious that it hardly even needs debate, or whether we'll be able to take this message and use it, this accident, and use it to say, look, fossil fuel is dirty energy, period. Even when it gets burned. A bunch of my crew organized a march in D.C. last week where they carried a huge banner down to the White House that said, Obama, this is your crude awakening. Okay? That's hopefully the message that we get across. We'll see. The politics are as poisonous in the U.S. as they are any place. And I was just in China last week, so I want to say I think Ross is right. The politics in China are in many ways more favorable right now than almost any place on the planet, which is a pretty scary thought when you think about it.
As long as you're not a Falun Gong member or anything like that. But just the issue of liability, though, is an interesting one because BP, it's in the Gulf. For the coal industry, it's the entire world. And I think hopefully that will eventually begin to show around the world. Before we move on, could I just ask you one other thing, Bill? In the last week or so, the Kerry-Lieberman bill has been put before the Senate, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that bill and what you think we should expect from it? Because that US climate bill that can pass the Senate is absolutely critical, in my view, to world progress on this issue.
Absolutely. So here's the trouble. Since Obama's given no leadership on this issue so far, the bill was essentially written by the energy industry, the utilities and whatever. It's very weak. That said, you're right, some kind of bill needs to get through. It will only get through, even this very weak bill will only get through if Obama decides to work hard to make it happen, if he puts some real political capital on the line. And what we'll find out is whether he's going to punt the way that Kevin Rudd did, or whether he's willing to put even modest political capital on the line to make it happen. We're getting close to our midterm elections, so I'd say the odds are even at best.
Okay, thank you. Just one other question while we're at it, because we don't get you here very often. EPA regulation, just say the bill fails. Can you see the EPA next year introducing, say, fuel efficiency standards for coal-fired power plants in the US?
The Environmental Protection Agency will have to, if nothing passes by law, start introducing series of regulations. They'll be challenged in the courts. It'll be a big fight. It may drag on for a long time. It raises the question again, or the point again, that you made a minute ago, that the real problem is that the energy industry knows that its great ally is delay. And that's all they have to do. And our systems are uniquely set up to make delay easy to achieve in a variety of ways. And so we need that EPA authority to regulate carbon, but it's not in and of itself a substitute for building the political movement that actually would allow that regulation to take place.
Yeah, sure. Clive Hamilton, you've recently thrown your hat in the political ring, running as a Greens candidate in Peter Costello's old seat. Did you learn anything through that experience about the difficulty of taking a conviction about climate issues into the political arena?
Well, the first thing I learnt running as a candidate was that don't go into politics if you're an introvert, because the door knocking will kill you. But I'd sent off the proofs of this book that's now come out, and as freaked out as anyone about climate change. And when I was asked to put my name forward as the Greens candidate, I felt an obligation to do it. I mean, it was, after all, a by-election that was held 2 days before the start of the Copenhagen conference. And I had, like others, this sort of a bold hope that perhaps we could turn it into the climate change by-election. But we didn't, even though in many ways the times were very propitious. And what I learnt from that is just how hard it is to get people to change. I mean, it takes a long time. People do change, but it takes a long time. And so I'm very much with Bill about the absolute importance of building a broad-based and powerful popular movement, which modelled perhaps on the moratorium movement of the late 60s, early 70s, which was unique because it brought together all sorts of diverse groups. It was a coalition of trade union groups, of women's groups, students, churches, and they all came together with this one or two powerful objectives which in the end won out. And I think really substantial action on climate is really only going to come about that way, which is why initiatives like 350.org, not that there are others like that, but 350.org in particular is so important.
Great. Look, we've heard a bit this evening, I guess, about political leadership from Ross and others. Would you like to give us your own take on our Prime Minister's reversal of policy and also Malcolm Turnbull's fate in the face of this climate issue?
Well, it's a funny thing about hope. When you desperately want something, you're willing to believe an awful lot, even though you sort of put on hold your natural scepticism. And so after many years of frustration and rage, really, at the Howard government's refusal to act on climate change, and John Howard was a denier, there's no doubt about it, to have a Labor Party campaign on climate was really, for many of us, a tremendous sort of liberation. And when Kevin Rudd won on the basis, probably climate change was the second or third most important issue in the election, many of us had enormous hopes. And when, was it a week, 2 weeks later, Mr Rudd turned up at Bali and announced in front of the whole world that Australia would immediately ratify the Kyoto Protocol, he got the ovation of his life. And we were proud as Australians because we'd been ashamed. Even as activists, and we were ashamed. We had to apologise for being Australians constantly. But pretty soon, it all started to come unstuck. And for me, a critical moment was a couple of months after the election, after Bali, when Kevin Rudd was being interviewed by Kerry O'Brien on 7:30 Report, and he said, "Well, Kerry, it's hard for me because on the one hand I have to balance the claims of the energy industries and the sceptics. On the other hand, I have to consider the claims of the environmentalists and the scientists." And I sat there and I said, "No, Mr Rudd, the scientists are not a bloody lobby group. They are not putting out an ambit claim. The IPCC report is not a political document. They are telling you what will happen." And I thought then, he doesn't get it. He does not get it. And the people around him don't get it. And I think there's actually a distinction here between Australia and the United States, because some of the people who Obama has appointed, like John Holdren and Stephen Chu, they really do get it. But I don't think that the senior advisors in the Labor Party get it. So I think that's why we've seen a constant process of backpedalling on the part of Kevin Rudd. And what he's shown is that in the end, he's not a leader, he's a manager. And Malcolm Turnbull? Look, I think I don't really know. I'm confused about Malcolm Turnbull. I think he probably gets it, but I also think that he's too willing to play personal political games in the pursuit of the objective, and therefore he's too clever by half.
Thank you, Clive. Yep. I guess your book sort of prompts us really to think of us all as climate denialists, if you want. And it's an interesting concept because I guess in a way if you have a sliver of hope, maybe you're a climate denialist, I don't know. But do you want to expound a little bit on that and tell us how you rationalise that and conceptualise
Well,
it?
it's been fascinating. I mean, I've been writing about climate change for some 16 or 17 years, and when you've been around it for that length of time, you start to watch the phases through which it goes. And it's always been, of course, a scientific issue, and it's been a political issue, it's been an economic issue, but increasingly it's a psychological issue. Because many of us have started to think, well, in the face of this overwhelming scientific evidence, why are we not acting? See, I actually think that this is a profound challenge to the whole Enlightenment project, because here for 300 years we've believed we're rational creatures. We look at the evidence, we weigh it up and we act in our own interest, and we're not doing that. And so we have to start to understand some of these deep psychological reasons which are preventing us from acting. And so that's why I've been working with one or two psychologists to try and understand this. And I can see, and recognising some of these denial strategies or avoidance strategies perhaps that I use as well. I mean, after all, who wants to believe it? I mean, if we could all not believe it, we'd do it tomorrow and we'd go and do something that's, doesn't wake us up in the middle of the night and leave us depressed all day. What we see is powerful forces, conservative commentators, denialists, the lobbying industries exploit this desire to disbelieve. And let me finish on this point, there was this brilliant case of it in the Australian newspaper, which, as you know, is the foremost organ of climate denial in this country. Actually, I've heard rumours that Rupert Murdoch, who famously in 2007 had his breakthrough and suddenly got climate change, he's actually now recanted. But Penny Wong gave a speech about sea level rise, and the next day, on the front page, the Australians' response was to carry this huge picture of a man, a bronzed Aussie, dressed in budgie smugglers, sitting on Bondi Beach, and his name was Lee. And the journalist went to Lee and said, "What do you reckon about this sea level rise?" And Lee said, "I've been coming to Bondi for 30 years and I've seen no change."
That's right. I was in Adelaide chairing the federal government's coastal committee at that stage, and one of our mayors actually had the same sort of response, but it was singularly dismaying to see that sort of reporting on such a critical issue.